Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel, and this is part two of our synopsis discussion of the role of sovereignty and development. In part one, we talked about how the concept of sovereignty is directly related to the structure of how we deliver development and some of the problems that arise. And we particularly mentioned the fact that we have one particular problem, which is what happens when states are actually failed or failing, when they are unable or unwilling to exercise the roles of what a sovereign state is supposed to be by definition. And we're going to look at that today. And it's not only what do we do immediately, but whether we don't see a very fundamental transformation occurring that might actually eventually challenge the very concept of sovereignty as it was understood since the Peace of Westphalia. Now, when we talk about failing states, well, it could be many reasons. What's important for us is not so much exactly why it's failing, but how we respond to the fact that a state is failing. Now, it may seem to be a complicated problem to respond to what seems to be a failing state, but I'm going to first propose that it really isn't. That actually there's a pretty simple formula for reconstruction of failed states or failed nations. A country has failed, all right? It may be because of war or drought or anything. The country is not functioning. What do you do? The first thing you do is you address the immediate needs. Our people need food, they need water, they need shelter, they need minimum security. You go in there and you address those immediate needs however you can. Then the second thing you do, as soon as you've addressed those immediate needs, you bring in immediate capacities that allow the addressing of those needs on an ongoing basis, as well as new secondary needs. So you may send in for security an international police force, but then the next thing you want to do is reconstitute the local police so they can actually provide security. Now, what's the third thing? You've now created some initial capacities. You recreate or create, if they were missing, priority structures. So you just can't get the local police together or the local doctors. You got to get some real hospitals in. You got to get a police force in. You got to get an education system, the schools up. So you create the priority structures in which these new capacities can work to sort of replace the emergency ones that came in. What happens then? Once you get these structures in, the next stage is actually to address and assist the priority needs of those structures. You create a new Ministry of Education, but now you have to start really seeing to it. Okay, do they have teachers? Do they have an administrator? Do they have building? Do they have a budget? You actually assist those structures to become structures. What's the next stage? You actually try to build what's called institutional capacity. You try to take these structures and make them into actual institutions, which means that economically, socially, ideologically, politically, they can begin to work and are supported in a fashion they can sustain themselves without having to rely perpetually on the outsider. And once you do that, the sixth step, which is the step that really is the return to normality, is you then work with these new institutional structures on shared priority concerns in partnership. So, very simple formula. Should work. Why doesn't it always work? Well, I'm going to give you three reasons why it doesn't work very often. One, very often we talk about reconstruction, and what we're really doing is reconstructing the problem, not the solution. So you have a terrible conflict in a country like Liberia, and what you do is you take the warring parties together, and what you really construct is a formal system where those who created the problem are now president and have other positions in the societies, and the others are losers or they're bought off in another way by being integrated into the army. But in fact, you haven't solved the problem. You reconstructed the initial problem. Again, this has been the history of a country like Haiti. You go in, so you rebuild you bring in food. Maybe you rebuild some of the public structures and that, but you don't really deal with the underlying problem, which is the social class problem, the political problem, the fact that there's no sense of shared common purpose. You don't deal with that. You reconstruct the problem, not the solution. So that's the first reason it very often doesn't work. The second and related one is that there's a lack of desire on the part of those whose participation is necessary in order to create the solution, which involves a transformation. There is a reason why many of the successes we've cited, such as Korea and the European Union and the Marshall Plan after World War II, came after conflict, because in those cases, conflict sort of purified the situation. It got rid of a lot of the resistance and structures of resistance by basically destroying them, and allowed new forms of social organization and new players to come in. But if that doesn't happen, and people aren't willing to transform, there's not much you can do about it. And the third one is that the rights and practices of sovereignty themselves preclude addressing the full scope and key issues. So in many cases, and this particularly is true, I think, in countries such as African countries where were constructed in colonial times, particularly to put together people in many cases who didn't naturally fit together, and to divide people who did, the divide and conquer strategy, and got carried over into the new borders of new states. The African countries have never been willing to redraw boundaries, and therefore, very often you find that the problems that you're dealing with, which are conflict between groups, feelings of incompatibility, lack of ability to move. You have countries where groups that naturally worked across borders now can't work across borders because there are formal barriers. And the only way to deal with these would be actually to go above the sovereign situation and deal with them on a regional basis across the nations. But the concept of sovereignty doesn't let you to do that. What does that mean? After the Congo transferred power from Mobutu to a new leader, Kabila, you had a war break out with had at one point 9 different countries involved in the Congo. And the real problem of the Congo was not just the problem of the Congo. It was the problem of the surrounding countries, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Angola, all of whom were involved for their own interests, not for the interests of the Congo. But the way this national system is structured, all the efforts focused on the Congo and bringing peacekeepers in the Congo, and nobody dealt with the fact that these other countries were acting in ways that were actually detrimental to solving the Congo's problem, and actually had to be part of a solution. Now, what can we do to change this situation? Well, the proposal is on the table that we actually have to transform the concept of sovereignty itself, to put in new stanzas of sovereignty, to say sovereigns not only have rights but responsibilities, and to hold people to them and not recognize sovereigns who don't exercise them. The second one is we have to realize that there are alternatives to nation-state sovereignty that are beginning to appear. An outstanding one is what we often refer to as international civil society, groups of citizens across borders who are beginning to say, we see ourselves as having a common purpose, identity, and interests across our borders, and in many cases, that's more important than the particular political policy of our immediate sovereign. Third way, new institutions of global governance. We're actually creating institutions like the World Trade Organization that begins to take some of those responsibilities, like the shopkeeper and the banker responsibility, and is putting it into a forum that actually sovereign states have to submit themselves to. We have built the world since the Peace of Westphalia on a certain concept of sovereignty. You've seen that old Westphalian sovereignty concept no longer serves. And the question is, to what extent are we going to actually create yet a new system that is as revolutionary in terms of how it changes the world as the Peace of Westphalia and its concept of sovereignty was in the past?